We want to welcome everyone to this, which will be the last of this series of our lunchtime lectures. And we're glad to see you here today on this beautiful day and before it gets too hot. Then I suppose I will be here for one more of these in September before I retire. And I'll probably give that one if Nola agrees. I had thought of maybe a topic, something like things I couldn't say while I still needed to keep a job. But we'll have to see on that how it goes. But today's topic is Moravians in the Great War. And talking with some folks coming in, I had just assumed that everybody would know that that means World War I. Though this person said, well, I thought maybe it was the Civil War, and I said, no, that's just the war. And, but of course they didn't call it World War I in 1914, since they hadn't had two yet, and it sort of would be really pessimistic to assume there's going to be another one, but we'll say more about that in a little bit too. But this is the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. This coming August, so we thought this would be a good way to lead you into whatever kind of meditations you may want to have on that. It was called the Great War, and it was a big war. But I was trying to think to begin with, well, why is this war different? It's not just that it happened all over the world, because if you remember in the 1700s, in the 7 Years' War, they were fighting in Europe, they were fighting in America, they were fighting off the coast of Africa, they were fighting in India. So really, it's not the first one that had global scene to it. It was one of the largest wars. The number of combatants in it was far greater than in those wars which had been in the past, which were fought by relatively small groups of people. These were mass armies. It was the technology, I think, which really set it apart in its horror from everything that had gone before. By the Civil War, you had Gatling guns, but you had to stop every little bit and change the magazine. But these, now, of course, we had gotten smart and invented belts of ammunition, which could go on practically forever. Aircraft were used not only as observers or bombers, but actual fighting one another. It's sort of ironic that Bishop Edward Rontaler, who did the memorabilia every year, in 1900, he had made some pretty amazing predictions about the growth of science and technology in the 20th century, including, he said, perhaps some sources of energy that are not at all available to us now, such as atomic power. But in 1913, his predictions were not so good, for he said then that we could really look upon the great advance and growth in military technology as a good thing. Because he said these weapons are of such mass destruction that nobody would be crazy enough to use them. Well, unfortunately, the good bishop was not correct on that one. And indeed, when the war did break out, he said that this was a failure of civilization. And it really was, because the late 19th century, everybody thought things are getting better and better and progressing, and it's just going to be a wonderful utopia to come. And we found out that technology can be a great help, but if you have sinful people behind the technology, it's not going to have such good results. Again, that was the major difference. It's not even that we had Moravians on different sides in the war. For that had happened before, obviously, in the American Civil War. So that was not the difference, but it was just the scope of it and the fearful technology. Well, to go back into the summer of 1914, the Moravians, with our great knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, had decided to have the General Synod, what we now call the Unity Synod, of the entire Moravian Church in the summer of 1914 in Germany. And they, let me get this for my notes for details, and since I've already written this once, I didn't bother to write it out again, except the book's too heavy for the stand. The Synod met throughout that summer, and it was in, May and June 1914. So actually, the Synod adjourned before all of the trouble started. Unfortunately, two of the main leaders in the southern province, Edward Rontaler and his wife Mary, and Bishop, well, not then Bishop, but Kenneth Fole and his wife, Bessie, decided that as long as they had gone all the way to Europe, they might as well take some time and tour. So when the Synod was over in June, they set off. Bishop Rontaler went to Berlin. And on the evening of 28th June, they decided they would take an evening walk. And while they were out strolling around enjoying the pleasant German weather, they saw groups of people beginning to gather on the streets and talking excitedly. And so they went to find out what was going on. And from a news broadsheet, they saw Archduke Franz Ferdinand assassinated. And Bishop Rontaler said, "I felt in that moment the coming of a vast calamity," though he had no idea then just how vast a calamity it was. Well, for a while, if you remember your history lessons, the war didn't break out immediately with the assassination. The people had to rattle sabers a good bit first. So for a month, there was relatively quiet, and the Rontalers traveled on to Königsfeld in the Black Forest, which is a lovely, spa. And then they went on to Paris, and they went on to Switzerland, and that's where the outbreak of the war caught them. They didn't quite know what to do. I mean, they were in Switzerland, but you didn't want to stay there. So they were advised to go on to Italy and to book passage on a ship there. Now, that proved a little harder than they thought because there was a panic in Italy, and the banks were all closed, and they couldn't change money. But they did find out where the American consulate was. That's the first thing I learned to ask when I was going to Prague is, "Kde je americké vyslanectví?" Where's the American consulate? So, and the consul got them passage on a ship, and they were finally able to get home okay. Now, the Foles had even worse experience because they had decided that while we're here, let's go to the Holy Land. So the outbreak of the war found them in Palestine. They made it to Beirut and got on a ship and were heading for home. However, the French Navy commandeered the ship in midstream, said we need it for a troop transport, and put them ashore in Smyrna. Well, again, they found the good, friendly American consul who advised them to head for Constantinople or Istanbul, and they were able, through a little bribery, to get passage on a ship. The story is, this is not in the history, the story is that Bessie had sewn gold coins into her petticoats, that being a safe place to keep them, and I'm quite sure it was. Anyway, so after Mrs. Fole had done a bit of demure unrobing, they got on the ship and were sailing down the Dardanelles when they passed several large German warships steaming up towards Istanbul. And they didn't know it at the time, but the one reason Turkey entered the war on the side of Germany was that these German warships had made it safely to Istanbul, past the British Navy. And so the Sultan thought, oh, well, they're going to win, they've already flummoxed the British. Now, the only thing about this is that the foals, as they're coming on their ship out of the Dardanelles, blundered right into the British warships, who were really frustrated at having missed the Germans and were more than a little ready to shoot anything they saw. Luckily, they didn't sink their ship, and eventually they reached Naples, where they boarded the Carpathia. Anybody remember what the Carpathia is famous for? Yes, it's the ship that rescued the survivors of the Titanic. It was still going. And so they finally reached American shores safely. And it was with great delight that September 1914, Wachovia Moravian had a big, bold headline, "Home Again." And so that went very well. But the war did change quite a bit the makeup and constitution of the Moravian Church, because up to that time, everything had been concentrated in Herrnhut or Bertelsdorf, the missions and all of that. That's where Bishop Hamilton had grown up, in Herrnhut, because his father was the American representative on the mission board. But during the war, of course, the various countries had to be assigned responsibility for whatever missions they could successfully serve. And that continued after the war into what we're more familiar now with various mission fields being assigned to different provinces throughout the world. But we'll say a bit more about that later. But I mentioned Bishop Hamilton, and he had some interesting experiences during the war as well. He had graduated from Moravian Seminary in 1914 and had served in the southern province as a summer assistant for a while. He had a brief pastorate back north, but with the outbreak of the war in Europe, we were not in it yet, but Bishop Hamilton felt that he ought to do something constructive to help in these perilous times. And because he had grown up in Germany and was very fluent in German, he was hired by the Red Cross to be a worker in German prisoner of war camps. And fortunately, Bishop Hamilton, being a Moravian, took lots of pictures. And so I have his scrapbook that he did of his adventures there in England with the German prisoners of war. And by the way, he entitled it "Behind the Barbed Wire, 1915 to 17. And I don't know how well you'll be able to see this. I'll put it out on the table for you later. But he has all kinds of interesting pictures of their YMCA thing, the main building, which was actually a converted whiskey distillery where they kept the prisoners. But he has all kinds of interesting views of them, and it seems, if you remember the horror that was going on in the trenches in France, those who had been fortunate enough to be captured early on actually had a pretty good time of it. And so you have them here with doing their calisthenics. They immediately formed a band, Moravians like that. But they had gymnastics that they were able to participate in, and a little orchestra. They had arts and crafts. So, really, if you had to be interred during the war, this was not a bad way to do it. And my favorite is they also had an amateur dramatic society. But there was one problem, of course, is that it's a German prisoner of war camp, and female leads were sort of hard to come by. So they had to dress some of the German prisoners up in female clothes to put on their dramatics. And a couple of these were loose, which is fortunate because I can pass them around. You have some very fine-looking women here who are actually German officers. So I don't know what that says, but we're not going there. But anyway, you can pass these around as you But Bishop Hamilton did record quite a few scenes here, and I think you'll find this interesting to look at as we continue on.
Excuse me, where was the camp?
Somewhere in England. I don't remember the little village. It was a little village. But anyway.
Is this the bishop's son, Kenneth? Or?
This was Kenneth.
This was
Kenneth, yeah.
He was a young man then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was older than I thought.
Yeah. But we're glad he kept his scrapbook all the time. Now, in addition, we have from closer to home a story of one of our own from here, from Bethania, John Butner. And I think I've mentioned this before in a talk. His son, who's also John, in 2006 phoned up and said his father had played in a military band during World War I, and would we like to have some of his music? And of course, Nola was agreeable to that. But when Brother Butner arrived, we were delighted to find out that he had not only brought the music, but some closely related artifacts. And one of them was his doughboy helmet. And he also had some pictures of him and his fellow buddies in the band, though I noticed they managed to get a couple of French mademoiselles there too. So you might like to see those in a minute. Now, this was an interesting story because you, of course, know the 26th North Carolina Regiment in the Civil War, how they were about to get drafted and figured they were less likely to get shot holding a tuba than a musket and volunteered to be the band. Well, it was not far from that John Butner was. He did get called up, and while he was in basic training, he noticed on the bulletin board an announcement, auditions for unit band. And like his forefathers in the Civil War, he figured he was less likely to get shot in playing in the band, so he immediately went to the auditions, and having played in a Moravian band since he was that high, of course, he sailed right through, and so he became the tuba player in the U.S. military band, and he was kind enough to give us his tuba. This was actually played in World War I by Brother Butner. We need to get a mouthpiece. Now, if you recall, in the Civil War, when they weren't being the band members had to help in the military hospitals. And of course, even in World War I, they didn't need the band all the time. And so they found something else for them to do, but it was not behind the lines in the hospitals. They put the band members to driving the ammunition trucks from the depot up to behind the trenches. Fortunately, Brother Butner did not encounter any unfriendly fire and came through quite well. Now, what about the music itself? That's what started all of this. And we have some of his band books, bass part only, of course. But let's see. They had some of the old favorites that you would expect, like Over There, and It's a Long Road to Tipperary, you know, all of those things. Some other romantic things, well, such as Goodbye Broadway, Hello France. And our sister Nola Canals' personal favorite, a little ditty called If He Can Fight Like He Can Love, Good Night Germany.
That as it turned out, he could.
Yeah, apparently. He was getting along with the mademoiselles. He also has a little French phrase book that he had as well. So anyway. But so that's a few personal stories of Moravians in the war. As I say, it did lead on the church-wide level to change in the way we did our missions. There was, of course, in Africa particularly, real danger for the missionaries who were on the battle lines between the British in South Africa and the Germans in Tanganyika. And by the way, it was largely because of the war that we got possession of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Not directly from the war, but we thought, it might be good to have a better base in the Caribbean. And that's why the U.S. bought the Virgin Islands in 1917 from the Danish government. And the Wachovia Moravian said that this is great. We now have several thousand more Moravians who are Americans. And they're very proud of that today. It did take a toll on our diaspora work in Eastern Europe, but the Moravian Church, despite all of the horrors of it, did come out fairly well after. And after the war, even though there had been great enmity between England and Germany, the Moravians got along okay and were able to work things out, though we were not able to have another synod until 1931, which is much longer than usual. But if you look at the whole experience of World War I, the cost in human suffering was just unbelievable. You've all seen the movies or read the books about the great barrages and how terrible things were, the living conditions in the trenches, affecting much more the civilian population than had happened very well, except from the time of the Huns, but other than that. But I can recall when I was serving in England in the early 1970s, there were a good number of ladies in the congregation who had never been married. They were single ladies. And they had lost their fiancés, sweethearts in the war. And some of them had never married simply because they never got over their first love. For others, it was not so much personal devotion as that there were no men for them to marry. So these were the ones who would have been about 18 or so during the war. And when you look at the thousands and thousands who were killed in that war, there simply were not enough men to go around for the women, and it was interesting to talk to some of them and their reminiscences and bringing out their pictures as well. But what brought it home to me, mostly just how terrible this was, is I was serving in a town called Oldham, which is near Manchester. And the town of Oldham in the early 20th century was about the same size as Winston-Salem. It also had a lot of cotton mills in it, which made me feel more at home. But if you have been uptown to the courthouse square and have seen the little memorial plaque to those from Forsyth County who died in World War I, it's about like that by like that, and has a fair amount of names on it, including my great-uncle Garl Tate, who was killed in the war in late October 1918, when it was all over. It's such a loss. But anyway, and it's sort of solemn to see that list of names and how many there are from Forsyth County, even in just a couple of years we were in it. But then I was in downtown Oldham when I was serving there and saw their World War I memorial. And it was not a little plaque like that. It was taller than my head, that wide, and there were 6 of them. From, imagine that kind of loss from a town the size of ours. And there were literally thousands of names. And I remember some of these ladies telling me that during the war they hated to see the telegrams go out. And if you recall, in World War I, the British Army was still organized territorially. And so you had the 31st Lancaster Dragoons, but they were all from the same place. And so when you had them sending them into the face of the machine gun fire and they're all be mowed down, all of these that are killed come from the same place. And so one of the ladies particularly said when she was a girl, she'd look out the front door and see the telegraph man start at the top of the street and go to virtually every house. And you're just sitting there and say, "Oh, don't come here, please, skip." And then the doorbell rang, and it was her brother. So, so as we are getting ready to observe the 100th anniversary of the beginning of this terrible war, I think that's what we need to. We have some interesting, artifacts here. And one of the ones for the future is a picture of Richard Starbuck with the doughboy helmet and the horn, which is in the archives. It will be preserved. So, we can sort of laugh at the foals and their adventures of getting out, but what we always need to remember is just how terrible this was. What good that might have been. All of these people for the next generation simply were not there anymore. And what it did to the human spirit who thought we're getting better and better and suddenly found out this is worse than it's ever been. And so it does call us again to remember what has gone before, and hopefully, maybe this time, we can learn a little better the lessons of the history before we are doomed to repeat them. And so far, we haven't done real well with that. But hope does spring eternal. One of my favorite sayings when somebody says something that's really unlikely, as I said, yes, and peace may break out in the Middle East. But let's hope someday indeed peace does break out, not only in the Middle East, but in the hearts of all people. So that's Moravians in the Great War. And thank you for being here. Yes, Tom.
I remember Dr. Walser Allen talking about going as one of the big two American delegates to the Synod of 1931, talking with us at some length about the misgivings of even going there then, because they were convinced that there was a good chance that unity would no longer be able to exist.
You're right.
And when you think of the reparations, think of what was visited on Germany as a result of the war, and taking away German land, a lot of it, that the bitterness within the European theater was deep. And we were part of that from the German standpoint. So he was rather eloquent at their doubts and their thankfulness that somehow the unity survived.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And there was indeed a real question about that, because before, nations had been at war, but they didn't take it quite as personally. But this one was really personal. And so it is amazing that even after that time, the depth of feeling, but that, thank heavens, we were able to work it out. Yes, John?
And I read about in Tanzania how all of the men were put in jail, the German men, missionaries, and all of the women and children were put in a camp, and they had no contact with each other. And how those women could get back to Germany was a terrible problem. And then all of the clergy were gone, and so they had to start using nationals. And that really was the beginning of Tanzania's, well, I can't remember what the sections are. They use these sections more than they use Tanzania.
Right, yeah, the various, southwest and
But
south, yeah.
How terrible it affected then South Africa too, because the Germans were all hated in those English colonies, and it was very difficult. But those are the places that have grown the fastest.
Well, God can bring good out of anything, apparently. Yes,
And of course, it was the terrific reparations that were laid on Germany following World War I that eventually led to the rise of nationalism and Hitler in World War II. So
Yeah.
there's another example of human short-sightedness.
yeah.
How much did the Virgin Islands cost?
Oh,
I think think it was like $17 million or something like that. It was a fair amount, but we got a good deal.
It's like Alaska was 7 million.
Yeah. And there's a lot more land in Alaska. Not that you can use a lot of it, but, so, yes.
Just a little antidote to this, and many of you may know Elizabeth Marks, and she tells a story during this time when they were gonna have to separate, and they were coming, they had to come home.
Mhm.
And they were on the ship, and the father said to them, today we talk English.
Mhm.
Up until that time, it had been German.
Mhm.
So from there on, it's because they knew they were gonna have to come to a safe place that spoke English.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mean, and I said the personal things, remember the German shepherds in Britain, the dogs? They wouldn't even call them German shepherds, they're Alsatians. And to this day, they're still Alsatians, so, yes, Tom?
When we were coming home from the movies, when I was growing up, my mother would say, well, go wash the Germans off your hands.
Well, anyway.
Wasn't that title of the war to end all wars?
Well, yes, and I'm glad you brought that up. I was about to forget. It was the war to end all wars. They hadn't learned that you got to change the heart. So they really thought it was going to be the war to end all wars. And in fact, that's the very reason that I'm able to show you this tuba today, because when the war was over and they were demobbing everybody, the U.S. government told the band's members to take their horns home with them because this was the war to end all wars. We'll never need another military band. So here's the instruments. And so it just, again, goes to show that we don't always realize the repercussions.
I thought
Yes.
it was interesting that in Herrnhut, God's Acre, up in the end of the cemetery there was a section for the German soldiers who were killed in World War I.
Mhm.
Their crypts were above ground,
Mhm.
and they were just set aside from the rest of the cemetery kind of. And also up to date, there's several movies just out right now.
Right.
If you watch Downton Abbey, for instance, that took place during that time, and more recently this Selfridge, which is on.
Mhm. Yeah.
But just on the other side, Gallipoli was on just the other night, if you've ever seen
Yeah.
that movie about the Turkish
Right.
fighting.
So,
Well, and the World War II memorial in Herrnhut starts with 1932,
mhm.
because that's when Hitler got his power, and it's all cracked.
Mhm.
It's in 2 sections,
Yeah.
and I mean, it's a very touching thing to see that.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and you mentioned at the end of World War I, of course, Germany was reduced in size. In World War II, of course, it was again. Though in one of the little villages near Herrnhut, this is not World War I, this is World War II, there is a little memorial plaque there, and I went over to read it, and it said, "Our lost East Prussian and Silesian homelands, we shall return." So it may not all be over yet, but anyway, but that's the Great War. So thanks for coming. Thank you. I'll put these where you